Next, I'd like to close this initial discussion of lines of credit with something called a recursive calculation. Sometimes we think of it as what's known as a circuit breaker. What I'd like you to see here is I've got my calculation here of my line of credit, and you'll notice I have the, if I just press an F2 to see what I'm referencing, I have the 181 minus the sum of banknotes, shareholders' equity, and retained earnings. So I can solve my line of credit. But you'll notice I have an if statement. So it says if D21 equals on, go ahead and do my calculation for the line of credit, otherwise 0. Now you might wonder, I'm just going to scroll up here to see what D21 is. D21 says recursive calculation, and it indicates off. Now, why we put recursive calculations in Excel when we're trying to figure out an iterative calculation is sometimes Excel has a tendency to go off the tracks in recursive calculations. A lot of times this happens because we're trying to define something in an odd way or a way that Excel's not used to looking at it. Maybe it's an insolvable iterative after 1,000, or sometimes there's just unknown reasons. But the bottom line is you can end up with a situation where you have a number of you'll have 0 with like, it'll be 0 point and there'll be like 20 zeros after the decimal, and everything will kind of just freeze up. At that point, if you haven't saved up until that point, you can lose all your work, and you might think, well, let's just go up and undo, for example. The problem is that Excel won't necessarily undo that kind of a problem. So what ends up happening is you can lose your work up until that point. So what you do here is you create a recursive calculation. And the way that if statement, it's very simple. All we're doing in this first test, if D21 is on, and notice right now, D21 is off. So if it were on, for example, I would click on, and now I would get my bank line of credit calculated. However, if I pushed off or typed in off, now it is untrue, so I would go to 0. Now the beauty of this is if you have a mistake, if you have sort of an iterative calculation that goes awry and you wouldn't be able to undo it, you could lose your work. But with this, you simply go from on, where it was calculating, to off, or really anything but on, and this goes back to 0, and you can rework on your formula. So keep that in mind. It could be useful in certain situations, and you might be able to find something. You might be able to save a headache at some point because you use this recursive calculation. Thanks.